Entre nous.
Entre nous.
There to talk about sexuality.
For you.
With you.
By you. Welcome in a new episode of the podcast Entre nous, the podcast of the Lovell Center. It's a non-profit organization in Belgium dedicated to sexuality and wellness and pleasure. So we're pretty proud to be one of the only center in Europe to talk about pleasure and orgasm, and we propose conferences, workshops, spectacle, but also podcasts. And we are driven by joy, orgasm, creativity, and enthusiasm. And today I have the great pleasure to invite Suzanne and Dr. Tishler on the mic. So welcome, and can you please introduce yourself?
Thank you so much, Oliver, for having us and hosting us on the show. My name is Suzanne Mulvehill, and I am a doctoral student at the International Institute of Clinical Sexology in Miami, Florida. And I am doing a dissertation on cannabis and female orgasm.
My name is Dr. Doctor Tishler. I'm a physician based in the Boston, Massachusetts, United States area. And many years ago, after having completed my training in internal medicine at Harvard Medical School and the hospitals associated, and then having spent about 20 years doing emergency medicine, I got very interested in cannabis, also called marijuana, not a term that I particularly like, and its use as a medical tool, as a medicine. And it was through that process and treating patients in my clinic here that I sort of stumbled upon this idea that cannabis could be used for sexuality. I had all of these patients who would come to me for various things like back pain or cancer symptoms. And they would come back and say, hey, Dr. Tishler, not only did this help with the symptoms I came to you for, but just so you know, I'm having the best sex I've ever had. And I had been doing some reading about that, and maybe I'd even given a little bit of a talk on that subject, but it started to really crystallize around that. And then Ms. Mulvehill, soon to be Dr. Mulvehill, came to me and said, hey, I'm working on this dissertation. Would you like to be involved and help me do that? And here we are.
That's wonderful. It's really an amazing topic to discuss. And so as you understood, the topics today is about the orgasm and also cannabis. Prior to go into the topics, can you share with us your intention by recording this podcast together today?
Sure. So for me, for more than 30 years, I had what I guess you could define today as a female orgasmic disorder, difficulty having orgasm. In my 20s, I would have one and I wouldn't have one and I would have one. And, I was married, went to my first sex therapist when I was in my early 20s. I remember buying a little book of like all the sex therapists, and they didn't have computers back then, so it came in the mail, and there was a therapist in, near me in Boynton Beach, Florida. So, it took me actually after the 8 months of therapy, I was able to start having some orgasms again, and then they went away again, went to see another sex therapist. And I went through this process for over 30 years, seeing 4 sex therapists in this time frame and finding that the therapy wasn't really working. I mean, talking about this quote unquote problem, I can tell you that shame ended up getting piled up on top of the problem. Not being in a happy marriage was part of that. Got out of the marriage, still had the problem, dated, still had the problem, and realized I was going to be carrying this problem like into every relationship that I had. So I would go sometimes one time for 7 years without having sex, 9 years without having sex, until I did a course in London. It was called Orgasmic Meditation, and that helped me get rid of the shame. Anyway, that's I'm going on a long story here, but my intention is to reach women, particularly who have struggled, I'm going to use the word struggled, with an orgasmic disorder, with this thing I'm going to call it this thing that can give us like, I just can share. I carried around so much shame and really had no one to talk to about it. So I ended up like packing it into work, getting a master's degree in business, becoming financially successful. And that's really when I realized that I had everything except love and a relationship in my life. So I did this, I went and worked on myself and found cannabis through a relationship that I'm no longer in, but I discovered that I had, for example, a female ejaculation. Like for the first time in my entire life, this experience happened and I thought, God, I wonder if cannabis had anything to do with that. And I tried it again and I was like, oh my God, this is actually kind of working for me. So that's kind of how I ended up beginning to go back to school to go get a PhD in clinical sexology. It was actually something I wanted to do after I saw my first sex therapist. But then I had 2 kids and I got sidetracked. And so I'm 60. It's kind of the last part of my career is really the greatest part in a sense, where everything I ever was afraid of has now become my career, where I can talk about it. I can be this. So I feel like when I did this course in London that no longer exists, one of the guys told me that it's my destiny to do this work. I had the idea to create a nonprofit during this time in 2017 called the Orgasm Project. I still had another company that I was doing full time. I sold that company in 2020 and went back to school that same year. So I'm here to give hope and inspiration to women. When I started my PhD, when I started my dissertation, I did a Google search for like cannabis and sexuality. And that's when Dr. Tishler's office popped up. One of the only, there was nobody else. There was somebody in Canada that was talking about that. And I made a call to his office and said, hey, I'm doing this dissertation on cannabis and female orgasm, looking for some help here in terms of guidance. And that's kind of how this path opened. So my desire as I move forward into getting my PhD, I'm in the survey process now, collecting data. Dr. Tishler and I have presented at 2 so far it's been via the internet, via 2 international conferences, the World Conference for Sexual Medicine. We presented theories there about how cannabis can be a treatment for female orgasmic disorder. Presenting at another conference in Orlando, actually in a few weeks, on the topic of how women who use cannabis more frequently are twice as likely to orgasm, and what are the theories behind that? So that's what I'm presenting on May 19th and 20th at the Cannabis Clinical Outcomes Research Conference. So I think that kind of gives a pretty rounded idea of letting men know that that there are proven pathways to orgasm. And that's what the Orgasm Project is going to be working on as I finish school. So thank you for asking that question, Oliver.
Thank you, Suzanne. It's so beautiful to listen to your life and feel that you are making this podcast with love and also generosity to give hope and inspiration to women and men and to better understand each other's and share what you learned about all those years of difficulties. So that's really kind of you to share it, because usually it's something that remains private or for experts, and so many women are in pain with that. I've had also many clients saying, I don't know what is an orgasm, and then you feel the psychological pain related to the fact that people feel inadequate. So we'll talk to that probably afterwards. So thank you. Dr. Tishler, can you share with us your intention and desire contributing to this podcast?
Absolutely. I don't have quite the personal story that Suzanne has brought. I'm certainly a very big fan of sex in general, but my motivations really come from patients, treating patients, being there to help support them along their journey, and being able, when possible, to be able to intervene on their behalf to make life better. And it happens that there are many symptoms and illnesses where cannabis can be used effectively to improve people's quality of life. And sexuality, it turns out, is one of those areas that's really not widely talked about, right? I mean, we sort of talked earlier about this is the intersection of two kind of taboo subjects, right? And cannabis certainly doesn't get very talked about, particularly, in Europe is a little bit behind the United States, which is a little bit behind some other parts of the world. And then obviously sexuality is something that probably ought to be discussed a whole lot more so that we could do away with a lot of the stigma and the shame that Suzanne was talking about. So my drive for this is really about helping people live their best lives. It also occurs to me that while our discussion today, the way I see our discussion today, this is about Suzanne's research and the exciting things that we're going to be able to help women with, that comes out of the research that I'm helping her with. But I also should mention that I have a book on the subject that is not yet published, but I'm in the process of looking for a publisher, which is basically, the working title is very simply Cannabis and Sexuality. I think we can do better in a final title, but that gives you the sense that really this is a book that's very much focused on who can benefit from cannabis for sexuality, both males and females, as well as the history of cannabis and the history of sexuality as we understand them, and then moving into sort of how do you do this in a way that is most beneficial and avoids the pitfalls that can exist.
Thank you for being part of this podcast to bring all those medicine expertise. And we know that science is learning every day, and that what we can share now can be adjusted tomorrow, even already tomorrow in 24 hours, because that's how the science is working. You started with the same process. You listen to the experience of people, to clients, to people that were suffering from some pain. And then with the use of some medicals, you see unexpected effect on sexuality. And that's how the science is observing and trying to put the piece of the puzzle all together to help people to live better and integrate everything together if we can put a meaning behind that. So thank you. It's really important to have an expert eyes here today to share state-of-the-art information, knowing that it's just right here, right now, what we can say in a very brief podcast of half an hour or 45 minutes. The next question is about, personally, what is your vision of the sexuality right here, right now? What's your understanding? Or you can define it for yourself. What is it?
That's an interesting question. When there's heart connection, I feel that passion really has a purpose. And in my life experience, passion is the doorway to heart and love connection, which can be expressed through sexuality. And there's a lot of power in that, power to change people's lives. It's not to be taken lightly. That said, sexuality can also be more of a casual nature, meaning there's not a heart and love connection. There is more of a pleasure connection as the main driver of sexuality, where the sexuality is, and I'm speaking about sex, I guess, at this time, sexuality in terms of how we express ourselves. I will give you a quick example of the power of sexuality in my own life. When I was sharing earlier about my company that I had, and I got free of the shame, literally got free of sexual shame, my sales for my company doubled that year. So when I went to go sell my company, my business broker and the guy who went to go buy my company, who bought my company, they asked, how did you double your sales that year? Well, I didn't exactly tell them, well, here's what happened. I got rid of my sexual shame. I actually started orgasming and I started having sex again, and my sales doubled for my entire company. So, no, I never said that. I said, well, I did some trade shows and I expanded into another region. But the truth of the matter is sex is powerful. It has the power to transform us. And my sense is that's part of why it has been remained taboo for cultural reasons, for conformity reasons, for societal reasons. But when we tap into our own personal power through our sexuality, anything is possible.
Thank you. It makes me think, when you talk about the power, I really resonate with it because personally, people ask, I was an engineer in the oil and gas drilling industry in the past for 15 years. And I'm now a sexologist and coach with teenagers and adults. And people say, why you do change? Exactly what you say is the power of sexuality and orgasm. I changed my life because I have the chance to live amazing orgasm, and none of them were the same, but really amazing orgasm in my life, sometimes with 10 years time difference between the first and the second. But it was so awesome. And I say, why no adult is talking about it? Why is it a taboo? Because some of them is more about like energetic orgasm. And except in Tantra, where you can find some piece of explanation, it's still a bit shame and taboo in science to say, okay, what about this kind of orgasm? And it's many people are passionate about sexuality, and nobody talk honestly with kids, teenagers, and adults. And I say, oh, it's time to do it, and it's changed my life completely. And I'm so proud because also it's so much vitality and energy and joy to do it. So yeah, I feel that power of change, which is tremendous. And what you live in your sexuality is in resonance or get direct impact in every domain of your life. So thank you, Suzanne.
You're welcome.
And Dr. Tishler, what is for you today, what it means, what is it sexuality for you personally? How you would explain it? Or
Well, I think that's a very complicated question, and obviously it means very different things for different people. And so, my particular view of sexuality, I almost feel is irrelevant. I will say that by way of background for your listeners, I just had my 30th wedding anniversary, so that sort of officially makes me an old married guy. And we have a powerful, active sex life that is more led by me than by her, which is one of those things where there could be some further discussion. But generally speaking, I think overall things are pretty good. But what I have really come to understand is that whether we're talking about males or females, that's not always the case, and that there is a whole lot of baggage that gets bestowed upon us by our family and our friends and our society, and some of it's internal, that sort of stands in the way of others developing the sexuality that they want. And so it's important for us as people who are providing care to others that we are able to relate to them, to bring answers to them, to allow them to explore in a safe way what it is that is helping or hindering their sexuality. For me, I don't think that there is a right sexuality or a wrong sexuality so long as it's consensual. And therefore, there are constructs around sexuality, sometimes religiously imposed, others morally imposed, others inherited from our growing up, that can either be a facilitator to our growth, both personally and sexually, or more often, unfortunately, are inhibitors of that growth and the quality of life that goes with it. And that we then spend a lot of our adult lifetime either suffering from those imposed points of view or working, as Suzanne has so successfully done, to overcome them. And I think that that's really the important piece, is that it can be overcome, that all of us are works in progress, and that our job as clinicians really is to empower people to make the changes, whether they're circumstantial changes or internal points of view or a whole mishmash of those things, so that that quality of life and that empowered sexuality can come to the fore and people can be happy.
wow, so beautiful. When you talk about empowering people and increase the quality of life and feel great and look at the diversity, and there is no good or bad, it just we're all different, and just be there to increase the quality of life of everyone. Thank you. So About the topic of today, about female orgasm, Suzanne, what do you want to share first, which is an important message?
I think having researched and read more than 900 research articles for my dissertation, one of the most interesting things that I discovered was that there was no consensus on the definition of female orgasm. There was an attempt at it in 2013 at a conference in Paris where some experts had made a definition for male and female orgasm. But there has also been more than 25 different definitions of female orgasm. And with that being said, the fact that there is in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, the definition of female orgasmic disorder, I guess as a as yet a non-clinician, meaning as someone who's an observer of this research, to think, well, how can there be a definition of the disorder if there's not a definition, a clear and defined definition of what it actually is, what the orgasm is, yet we know what the disorder is. I mean, we do know what it is when a woman has never had an orgasm. And we also want to communicate that studies have shown that up to 41%, so nearly 50% of the female population in the world has some dimension of an orgasmic disorder. And that percentage has been found statistically to have not changed in more than 50 years. And that research came out of Finland by a doctor there, that despite all of our sexual freedoms, women masturbation or sex therapy, that percentage has not changed. So that's what I wanted to share about that.
Suzanne, if I could ask you a question for the audience. You talk about disorder, and I think that it's certainly possible that there are people listening who are thinking, well, sure, I struggle maybe sometimes to have an orgasm, or maybe I just don't have them. But does this mean I have a disorder? And, do I meet that bar? Should I be seeking treatment? So could you clarify maybe sort of who should be thinking about themselves in terms of seeking help?
That's a great question, Dr. Tishler. And I think my experience on the answer to that, as well as what the Diagnostic Statistical Manual shares, is it's only if it creates distress. That the definition was redefined the last time that they redid the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's called the DSM. When someone goes in to see a therapist, if it creates distress, that is really the spot or the point for a woman to, if she feels distressed, if she feels shame, if she feels it's holding back her ability to have a relationship. She doesn't want to have sex, or she's completely lost interest in sex. I mean, that's another, and then it becomes a choice. But the fact that it had created some distress, it has been defined as the defining factor of whether it's a disorder or not. How does that sound?
I think that sounds great. I think I might reframe that slightly in terms of quality of life that I keep bringing up. I think that, yes, if a woman is distressed, we can say that it is affecting her quality of life. If a woman has, I'm not sure given up on it is quite what I'm really getting at. But if a woman is not having orgasms and it's not bothering her, then that's really not a disorder, right? That's a choice or a life circumstance or something. But if it isn't bothering her, then there's no need for us to sort of impose, oh, you should be having orgasms, right? There are women for whom orgasms or sex at all simply is not important to them anymore or ever or any of those sorts of things. But if they are, thinking, gosh, I don't like having sex because I never get much out of it, then you've already set up that tension. I wish I could have this, but I can't because, right? And so that, I think, would be sort of the definition of that quality of life or distress situation. I don't care about sex. is a perfectly fine statement. But if it's followed by because I never get anything out of it or because I never have an orgasm, that's slightly different from I just fundamentally don't care about it. And so I think for the people listening, that's a distinction that's worth noting, because if there are women out there who are saying, yeah, I don't care about sex, but then they start to think, yeah, but I really actually kind of wish I could be having sex if I were getting something out of it, that's different from I really don't care.
I agree with you. I think the phrase that you said, it's not bothering her. It doesn't bother her, but if it affects the quality of life, meaning, for example, a woman who may not have a partner yet wants a partner and doesn't understand why she doesn't have a partner, but she doesn't have any interest in having sex. So some of this is buried, meaning it may be under the surface that it's not bothering her. Yet what I heard you share too is there's a little bit of it could be that there's some irritation in there. I don't get anything out of sex. Okay, well, why not? So if a woman wants to start going to that spot, I know of a woman who wasn't having orgasms, wanted to have orgasms, but when she started to do this work, it was rising up, anger was rising in her, and she didn't want to open that door. And that's fine. That was her choice. She closed it back and that was okay. It's a very individualized and personal choice.
Suzanne, you mentioned something very essential. We talk about fundamental aspect. We question fundamental aspect of orgasm. When you say that you observe in the literature, in the scientific document, that there are 25 different definitions of orgasm, how we can define there is a disorder scientifically if there are so much variety of the definition. And it raises a lot of questions. Is there a difference of definition for men and women and what it could be? And don't we have a simplified version of the orgasm for the men, while we have a more complex understanding or vision of the orgasm for the woman? While basically we have a body, which is a nerve system, which is a cardiovascular system with hormones, with muscles, with the blood. Everything is pretty the same, but anyway, it seems there is a big difference scientifically when you talk about orgasm for men and women.
In the 2003 the Paris Convention that was on sexual medicine, when the consensus was made about female orgasm, the definition, and male orgasm, the one thing that stood out for me was that the woman's orgasm creates an altered state of consciousness. It did not say that in the definition for males, for men. My personal feeling is it doesn't just create it, that we need to be in an altered state for it to happen as a woman, as my personal, I used to wait for okay, I'm going into an altered state of consciousness, no, it doesn't work like that. If that little alert system is on, that's not going to let it happen. So that altered state of consciousness really is where the tie-in or the link with cannabis comes in, which we can talk about in more detail if we would like to. But learning how to be in an altered state of consciousness, learning what that means, and calming the nervous system so that the alert, the vigilance, the woman's vigilance of, oh, I'm feeling this. Oh, am I feeling that? Is that really what I'm feeling now? Am I going to have an orgasm in a minute? All of that thinking actually is what inhibits the orgasm. So that's what that's what stood out to me in these definitions between male and female orgasm.
If I may jump in, then I'm going to take a slightly different point of view, which is that I think that as much as we have discovered that female orgasms have been inadequately researched over the last, 30, 40 years, male orgasms have been researched far less. And that I think that the definitions, particularly the issues around consciousness, unconsciousness, altered mental status, all of those apply to men as well, but they haven't been looked into with the degree, the lousy degree that we've even seen for women, and that oftentimes research in men gets very fixated upon the sort of obvious things. Did he get an erection? Did he ejaculate? Right? Those are things that are obvious and measurable. And so oftentimes researchers will focus on those sorts of things without really addressing the question of, did he have an orgasm? Well, if you equate an orgasm in a male with an ejaculation, I think you're missing the boat, because there's certainly much more going on between his ears than simply ejaculating semen. And furthermore, when we get into that post-orgasmic state, which we tend to call satisfaction or intimacy, there's a whole lot going on there that I think is very equivalent between the sexes, but that again hasn't really been explored. And generally speaking, and this is a big generalization, but I think that men are far more reticent about speaking about these sorts of things than even women are. And so it's harder even to sort of dig into what they're thinking and feeling. And so some of the dichotomous thinking that, women are different from men, it isn't, I think, accurate. And I think that when we look at the physiology, then there's very little support for the idea that men and women are really radically different.
It raised to my mind a very important point is where the diversity is huge. I think in the average or in the mainstream discussion, we trying to simplify the sexuality of the men and make it maybe so simple that there is no question. And the fascinating word about, all those challenge of reaching orgasm or high pleasure for women is a huge path of learning, because maybe the journey is more important to meet yourself, to go in connection with yourself and to learn deeply and connect to your power and huge satisfaction of a beautiful journey. And I'm sure that if we open the box for the men, we will start to discover much more stuff also. Because some women may feel inadequate, but I have also client men that are saying, oh, I don't have orgasm, or I don't have pleasure, or I don't feel nothing, or it's, they have a similar, but it's a bit taboo for them to accept that beyond erection or ejaculation, there is no real orgasm for them behind or together with it, and they are a bit lost with it. But as soon as there are some physiology effects, they are accepting a bit. But what kind of learnings or important points you can further develop now to help men and women to in this journey of understanding the orgasm and feeling better with themselves?
I'm thinking I had gone to see there was a sex therapist speaking at a university some time ago. And what she said was, that has stayed with me all these years, is become friends with your own sexual response. Don't judge it. Be with it. Meet it. Enjoy it. Like, own it. Let it be yours. Let it be ours. Oliver, when you said, like, meet yourself, like, that stood out to me. Like, meet yourself. Like, meet your sexuality. I think a lot of times of the term goal-oriented sex, like, and you think about just as of the basics, the woman comes first, then the man comes, like, it's all about, okay, when the man comes, it's over. Not necessarily. And that's kind of going beyond, like when you mentioned beyond erection, like for men, what's beyond erection and ejaculation? Like, what's beyond a woman worrying about whether she's going to orgasm or not? Enjoying the moment, being in the pleasure. So I think that's really, by the time, what happens for me is I go so deep into answering these questions that I forget what the question actually is. I'm just going to stop.
I will chime in with the following thought, which is that, when we look at the presentation of men and women to primary care medicine for issues around sexuality, I think you can imagine that those numbers are not very good. But what's interesting to me is that those numbers do differ a little bit by sex, and that while the number is only about 30% in women, it's really only about 18 or so percent in men. And then if you remember that many men who are presenting to their physicians for discussions of sexuality are really there for erectile dysfunction, for which we have certain sorts of medications. If you factor out that number, what you realize is that when we're talking about sort of the bigger picture, the less physiologic, the less mechanical issues around sexuality in men, those numbers are so small that they're actually really unmeasurable. So again, it's very clear that there's a whole lot going on under the surface, not only for individuals, but for us as a society in terms of being able to do the research effectively and also to be able to reach out to people who are suffering from these sorts of issues and making it safe enough and okay enough for them to come forward and ask for help. And that we have to change.
What I found also fascinating with orgasm is that I used to make a conference of 2-3 hours about it because there is such a diversity of experience of orgasm that comes, you don't control it. It comes suddenly and sometimes you cannot really expect it. It was just there once gone away. And it could be triggered by different kind of stimulation with a sound, with a touch, with so many possibilities, with the core muscles. And it's a very wide possibility of experience. And I really wonder, how is it really possible to define an orgasm? Because the variety is very broad about it. And maybe we need several words to define it, to put more understanding, because you can distinguish more piece of the puzzle and start to see what you know, what you don't know, and start to meet yourself, because everyone is different. You cannot expect to have the same kind of experience as someone else.
I agree with you, Oliver. And just listing, like, we think of women with clitoral orgasm, nipple orgasm, vaginal orgasm, anal orgasm. They've even in the research talked about a woman who could orgasm with the stroking of her eyebrow, that orgasm happens in different ways. And I think the focus of it being one way, did you have an orgasm? Like loosening that and exploring the body in the different ways the body can orgasm. And like you had shared, that you can't control it. It's just there. I feel, and having done this, we can block it with thinking about it, worrying about it. Is it going to happen? Like all of that vigilance can actually inhibit the orgasm. In fact, in the 80s, the diagnosis for what is now referred to as female orgasmic disorder was called inhibited female orgasm and inhibited male orgasm, meaning that it was there, but it's inhibited. So it's freeing ourselves to explore and what may be in the way of it if it's not happening.
And this might be a good time for us to segue a little bit into talking about the value of cannabis in these circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
As most people who have experienced cannabis can attest, this substance, when ingested, creates an altered state like Suzanne was talking about. And if we can use this in a thoughtful and careful manner, then we can achieve a state where a lot of that inhibition that she was just talking about kind of takes a back seat. I would never want to say it goes away, but we can kind of distance ourselves from it. We've got these voices in our head that say, good boy or bad girl or things like that. And they get into that vigilance and that worry that Suzanne has been talking about that just then stands in the way of achieving that kind of harmonious experience. And by using a small amount of cannabis, we can kind of push that voice aside and say, look, you know what? I know you're there, but I'm not going to deal with you right now. Right now, I'm in the moment. I'm relaxing. I'm having this experience. And what comes of this experience will be what it will be, and it will be wonderful and enjoyable. And that's really, there are physiologic changes associated with using cannabis in terms of lubrication and erection and the stimulation of desire. But really, when we're focusing on the issue of orgasm and the frequency and the intensity and sort of the quality, intimacy around that orgasm, that's really what we're trying to achieve using cannabis. And it works in both, again, males and females. I would say that it is important, if we're going to digress and talk about males for a second, that we be a little bit more focused on the dose There's a little bit more leeway for most females in terms of what that dose is, sort of where is that sweet spot. For men, it's a little bit more complicated because if you cross that threshold, things can actually become inhibited, particularly on the erectile side of things, because it turns out that maintaining an erection is actually something that you have to kind of be present to do. But the point really is that creating that altered state that Suzanne has been talking about in all people allows us to be able to explore that orgasmic potential and appreciation and self-love in ways that some people can't access without a little intervention.
Wow, it's really, really beautiful, because indeed it's more about not the body is not adequate, but the way we make love can block or inhibit or prevent the full expression of the body with the pleasure and maybe a climax, an orgasm or whatever that could happen and you can never control. So it usually could even not become an objective because it's nothing you can control or invite. It just, you can be in a state that is favorable. And I remember some experience, of a sexual experience with my partner when we just become the movement and the sensation. And at the end, when you talk about harmonious experience, I was bringing that experience to my mind back. And yes, at that moment, I remember that I didn't know who I am. It's like, which body is who? Which sensation is what? It's like I don't know what are the limits of my body. It's like, you cannot be touched without touching someone. You cannot touch someone without being touched, You can see someone and that people cannot see you. But when you touch someone, both are touched. And it's like, when you are in the harmony of being free in the experience to explore and open the body to the potential of marvel, something can happen. And that's where probably the cannabis can help a lot, is that it creates a different perspective on the mind and body exploration. Do you think that once people can experience an orgasm, maybe thanks to the cannabis, it's just open a door and because they experience it once, they become more familiar about the ingredients which are adequate for them to develop the potential of pleasure, with less fears or looking to yourself or worry or vigilance or whatever. It's like you allow yourself to experience something and then you become more free to experience it by yourself without any additives, I would say. What do you think about that?
I think that there's absolutely possibility for that. It's a learning process in some ways, or perhaps it's a forgetting process. I'm not sure. But in either case, I think that it's unlikely that just in the nature of human beings, it's unlikely, I think, that sort of a single cannabis experience will be such a revelation and open the door so completely that that's all you'd need. But I think it's much more a matter of using this tool as a way to learn about what you like, what you don't like, and even to some extent, while sort of scooting some of those inhibitions out of the way, you also get a perspective on those inhibitions, right? You can say, I'm going to be in the moment and I'm going to not pay attention to these things that I've now put kind of on the shelf. But at the same time, by putting them on the shelf, I think you kind of get a good look at them and you can start to say, all right, I'm not going to deal with this now, but later, maybe I'm going to unpack that box and see what's in there. And so I think that that's very much a process. And I would very much hate for anybody who is listening to this discussion to run out and buy some weed and then say, I had a great orgasm, but it didn't fix me. I don't know that I think it fixes people. I think it's a tool that allows us to gain insight and maturity over time that then may lead to being able to have those kinds of intimacies and orgasms without the substance after we've kind of done the work, if you will. More like therapy in that way than it is like a medicine that you take, like an antibiotic, where you have a problem and then the problem goes away. This is much more like therapy, where over time you get a handle on things and things become better.
I agree with Dr. Tishler. And just to share with you, I only started using cannabis a few years ago. I was very much against it. I was married to someone who I saw, or at least experienced, using it in a way that wasn't helpful. I mean, using it to cover up versus explore. So I think the intention, like using it as a sacred medicine, when I use it with intention and also creating a practice of using it to, like Dr. Tishler shared, where the cannabis will let me know where I need to look, what kind of work I need to do on myself. When I first started using it, I used to have to put my conscious mind like in one room watching television. Like, okay, we're going to put you over here. And are you comfortable? And watch some, like I had my mind, I would have a tight gut. My gut would actually be tight because I just didn't know how to let go. I didn't know what surrender meant. I didn't understand it. And over time, this inner sense of trust. And I heard throughout our sharing, the word safety has come up several times. The self, like knowing my own sense of safety, feeling safe is very, very, very important to let go. Even with cannabis, like to get into the practice of going into an altered state, creating an intention. What do I want to experience here? What do I need to learn here? And letting cannabis be a guide for that experience. So, and in my experience of using it, like creating pleasure practice with cannabis, like letting myself explore myself with the medicine. And like you shared, Oliver, that maybe in the future, or sometimes yes, sometimes no, using it with sex. I mean, statistics and studies show that some research out of by Dr. Becky Lynn in 2019 in Missouri showed that more than 30% of women were using cannabis before sex, and that women who used cannabis more frequently were twice as likely to orgasm. One other piece of research that I found fascinating was by a Dr. Kasman in 2020, and what he found was that regardless of why a woman used cannabis, the frequency of cannabis use actually was decreasing any type of sexual dysfunctions by as much as 21%. So there is something that maybe Dr. Tishler can speak about on frequency of why that plays a role. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. But this frequency of cannabis use seems to play a role in sexuality, female orgasm.
That's a really interesting question, Suzanne. I'm not sure that it is a chemical or physiologic phenomenon. I would guesstimate that women who use cannabis more frequently, particularly with regard to sexuality, two things. One is that suggests that they're actively trying to improve their quality of life. That's number one. So, I mean, they're a committed or a motivated group to start with. And then on top of that, they're having that experience, that learning experience that we were just talking about on a more frequent basis. If we think about any kind of learning, if you do it infrequently, if you want to be a pianist and you practice once a month, you are certainly going to get less far in your skill than if you practice every day. And I suspect that there is a very much an analogy there that the more you practice having intimacy and orgasms, whether by yourself or with a partner, the more likely you are to get good at it. So I think, that's really important. You touched on something that I think is also important, which is that because this is a new and taboo set of fields, and also because it's just a new experience for many people, my recommendation is that if you're thinking about using cannabis for sexuality, you don't start with your partner. You start, as you had said, Suzanne, exploring yourself. And I talk in my book, there's a whole chapter on sort of setting the stage, and whether that's, a hot bath and candles or whatever, that gets us in the mood, if you will. And then by using cannabis, we can kind of cross that bridge to put those fears and inhibitions aside. But that doing this with a partner can become, let me rephrase that and simply say, jumping to the partnered sexual experience without adequately first spending some solo time brings in at least one other person's worth of baggage. And that just makes it much more complicated. And it is, I think, much more successful if one starts out by using cannabis by oneself and masturbating and exploring the feelings that you can achieve, the relaxation. What is it like to be in this altered state? What are the fears? What am I putting in that box? All of those sorts of things, so that then after a few sessions, perhaps doing it that way, you're feeling more confident and more ready to engage in partnered sexuality. And that way, when you're meeting with your partner, you not only have more knowledge of what is likely to happen, but also that confidence that that, for example, you have been able to achieve some very pleasant orgasms by yourself. And so that how the cannabis is working and that it is achieving some benefit for you in that solo situation. And so that being in the partnered situation doesn't have to have all of those anxieties overlaid while you're trying to now focus on what does it mean to have sex with my partner in this altered state. So that kind of solo preamble, I think, is very, very important. And let me take a moment to shift gears to something that's very practical and say that there are a lot of different ways that we can consume cannabis, many of which are not actually all that helpful in this situation. And that is certainly for people who are relatively new to cannabis, there is this strong feeling that, well, I don't want to smoke it. And so therefore, I will go with an edible. Edibles, as you know, are small bits of food stuff that have cannabis added to it. And generally speaking, I can respect and understand the desire to avoid smoking per se. But the edibles are really not a better solution, because the edibles can be very unpredictable in how long it takes for them to work, what is the right dose, and then how long will they last. And certainly when we're talking about a partnered encounter, it's very fashionable to talk about sort of romantic multi-course infused meals. But in fact, that's problematic because you just don't know that everyone is going to sort of get revved up and land, sexually speaking, on the same page at the same time. So my recommendation really is to put aside the edibles. If you want to have a romantic dinner, great, just do a regular, normal romantic dinner, but then get a quality cannabis flower vaporizer, not one of those little oil pens, because those aren't very safe, but the kind of vaporizer that you put the cannabis, the ground up weed into, and where you can set the temperature exactly to 350 degrees, or as you guys say, 180 degrees Celsius. That's the ideal temperature for vaporization. And you can use this to very carefully monitor the dose that you and perhaps your partner is getting. And you can also use this as part of the foreplay. So the vaporizer becomes part of the warm-up activities, obviously after you've done the solo experiments that I talked about a few minutes ago. But this is a way of making sure that it's working, that we're being careful and not overdoing it, and that we can bring everybody to the bed, so to speak, kind of at the same time, ready to go.
I'd like to share, I think, what Dr. Tishler is sharing about, I think it was great what you've shared about helping people, especially if they have never used cannabis, and in some countries it's not legal yet, so the access to it can be challenging. But for example, a woman who would like to start a practice, a pleasure practice, and integrating some cannabis to explore different paces, maybe use the other hand, see what comes up emotionally, make a commitment. I mean, I have a group of women that I have been meeting with online for 2 years who are doing a pleasure practice as a commitment to their sexuality. So the practice is really important, as Dr. Tishler had mentioned. And something that a therapist had shared with me years ago is that, like, neurons that fire together, work together, fire together. So the neuroplasticity, which is really where the brain then learns new neural pathway, like there's if we're learning to play the piano, for example, we can start to memorize how to play the piano without looking at the notes. If we can apply that same philosophy to learning how to explore one's body with masturbation, what feels good? When does it stop feeling good? When does it start feeling good? When does a woman start thinking? When does the thinking kick in? When is she not thinking? Like, to begin to really pay attention without vigilance. That I want to add that caveat that it's more of a, say, post the pleasure practice session, like a 20-minute, 30-minute. When I first started with the pleasure practice, I actually created meditations for myself. 2 of them are on YouTube. I can share them with Oliver after, but I would listen to meditations and kind of get out of my head and get into my body and pay attention with the cannabis of what feels good, what comes up. Journaling is also a part of this, using the after the pleasure practice, after the high from the THC is experienced, where did you feel good? Where was the growth? I found that I would occasionally still go for the goal, and then feel disappointed that it didn't work. And it's like, okay, well, what is that about, Suzanne? Very goal oriented, like getting out of the goal, getting into the pleasure, that it doesn't matter if the orgasm happens or not. What matters is, what am I feeling? And how does it feel? So really going into the feeling versus removing ourselves from the thinking. And that's where cannabis can help us create new neural pathways, and Dr. Tishler, maybe you can expand on what that means when you create a new neural pathway.
I wish I could, because, it's interesting. There are all sorts of studies out there looking at kind of what areas of the brain light up with sexual stimulation, and particularly with orgasm. And it's been looked at in men and in women. And, there's some commonalities, but it's sort of like we're still looking at the moon without a telescope, right? We could see that it's there, but we really don't understand kind of, what's going on in the nooks and crannies where all the important details lie. We have a very clear understanding at this point of sort of where consciousness lies and how it interacts with kind of those higher order vigilance, those voices. We understand that, but how we retrain ourselves to be able to let go of that baggage. See, right now we're away from neurologic language and back into psychological language. How that happens on that neurologic level, I don't think we have a really good understanding. It's clearly involving a lot of the memory pathways through the hippocampus, but it's just not that simple, because we understand that most of those sort of super ego-esque voices really live in the frontal lobes and interact through the prefrontal lobe to create, the me, the where our consciousness lives. A lot of the medications like cannabis and some of the psychedelics, their role is really to kind of shut down certain areas of our brain, the ones that are filled with those kind of should and ought to, and really then allow us to explore the parts of our brains that are otherwise inhibited by these parts that have been shut down. But how that translates into our becoming sort of better, happier, more fulfilled individuals, I don't think we're there yet. We can simply appreciate that certain chemicals like cannabis or MDMA or psilocybin can help us achieve the kind of insights or learning that then allows us to be better. And I think I'm going to have to leave it at that.
What is really amazing is that we touch to the magic of the body. It's like very concrete, and we talk about the physical body, but also it's like also a bit spiritual and philosophical, because it's really humble to say, okay, we can just appreciate what we observe and be curious. It's a very, very rich discussion. I was saying to myself, when we, let's say we have pleasure with ourselves or with a partner, how I talk to my cells, to all the cells of my body. Because in fact, when we start to be excited, we touch, there are molecules, we produce neurotransmitters, hormones, and we fill the body with a lot of molecules that probably impact the neural system, but also the sensors, I would say, on the cells walls. And everything is changing and adapting. And it's like the ear of the cells will... The only thing that our cells can hear, the internal ambience of molecules. And if we can shut down the mind, as you say, with the ego or the should or the fears or whatever, and we feed our body with beautiful sensation and just listen to it, it's already a big step to progress, to understand how our own body is working. Because I'm pretty sure that every body will... The entry door of pleasure is different and it's very unique. And I encourage people to talk, to discover themselves and also share with a partner what are their specificity. Because you are so different. There is no formula, there is no guide. You just have to talk to your partner, communicate and say, this is how I love, this is the kind I already know about me, this is the kind of touch and sensation which is creating a beautiful sensation and where I feel joy inside me and increase the quality of my life with thanks to sexuality. It's like a lever to increase the quality of joy and the life by basic steps, step by step, slowly. We already share a lot. I wonder, Dr. Tishler or Suzanne, if there is something important for you to share prior to maybe close the podcast, and wish a very great journey to all the listeners. And we hope it will help them to be curious, humble, and fascinated by themselves with a lot of compassion, whatever they already live with some orgasm or no orgasm. But maybe you want to share some advice, extra advice.
I was just going to say, I'm not entirely sure I have more advice. I think we've really talked about a lot of very important stuff today, but I also think that it's, there's only so much we can accomplish in a podcast, of course. So it seems to me that it would be important for your listeners if they were nodding their heads and thinking, yeah, this could apply to me, to be able to reach out to Suzanne and to myself. And so I will let Suzanne speak for herself. But if people are interested in reaching out to me, they certainly can by going to my website, which is inhaleMD. That's INHALEMD.com. And there are a lot of articles on that website in our blog that are very helpful and written for non-clinical folk. And there's actually a search bar. So if you go to the search bar and you put in sex or something like that, you'll come up with a bunch of different articles that talk about this sort of thing. And if people want to email me directly, they can do that through the website, or they can email me at doc@inhalemd.com. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tishler. And my website is orgasmproject.org. It's a 501c3 nonprofit organization based in the United States. And there is a blog on the website with a number of articles. We continue to add information and research. You can sign up for updated information on orgasm research through just to our newsletter on orgasm research. Also, there's a library. We're putting together a portal of female orgasm research for it to be found in one place. For example, if you wanted to look up about altered states of consciousness in female orgasm, then you can look at articles about that. Wanted to look up, different types of articles, they're available that way. And our own research. So if women are listening to this who use cannabis and are sexually active, you're welcome to take our survey. That's for my dissertation. That can be found under the Our Research section. And the website is info@orgasmproject.org is where you can reach me directly. Thank you so much, Oliver, for this opportunity, and Dr. Tishler for being here too.
Thank you. Thank you for both of you for this wonderful podcast. I really hope that it will help people to feel better with themselves, to have compassion about themselves, and really, whatever they are in their life and sexual life, feel good with adequate, curious. And indeed, I really appreciate that you are open to that the listener can contact you and first look at your production articles or study or anything you can share so that they can further understand themselves and maybe make great progress they are looking for a long time. Thank you for this great moment. It's a very long podcast. It's the first time, but I think it was very important to give enough time to talk about that topic, which is a bit of unknown and taboo, and which bring a lot of important questions about sexuality.
Thank you. This was great.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting and for this to be women and men can listen. And it's a step towards more awareness, understanding, and pleasure.
Absolutely. Thank you again. It's important that we get the word out to people that there are resources that can help them feel better. I mean, that's the name of the game, right? It is ultimately we want a life that we can be proud of and that we've enjoyed. And it's important that people who, may be struggling with this aspect can get that kind of support. So thank you again for all that you're doing, Olivier.
Thank you.
Entre nous.
Entre nous.
There to talk about sexuality.
For you.
With you.
By you.